Perfect.
Okay, so I will start. Huh? So hello everyone. Good morning or good evening, wherever you are on the planet. So I'm Fabrice Testa. I'm the chairman of EBAN Space, which is the group specialized in space within EBAN, and EBAN is the European Business Angel Network. And I'm really very pleased to kick in this series of webinars this week that EBAN Space co-organized with NewSpace Capital, which is a growth stage capital firm headquartered in Luxembourg. So the idea is that during these webinars, we want to give you a 360-degree overview of the space industry pre and post-COVID. Investors will explain how they react to the crisis and which opportunities they see. Some speakers will talk about the public policies in place to support the space sector. And we will also have entrepreneurs with us to explain which concrete actions they take to face the corona crisis. And today, this first webinar is about the COVID-19 impact. So as I think everyone heard, there is the aeronautic sector, which is highly affected by the crisis. But others are affected, like end users of satellite communication, like cruise ships, oil and gas exploitation. So it cannot be ignored that the space sector is also suffering from the crisis. So where are the doom days? And our speakers will try to answer these questions. We know that historically space is less correlated to crisis because of the heavy support from government. So our speakers will try to explain if there is some resilience of the space sector facing the crisis. And finally, we want to know where are the opportunities. We hear about opportunities in healthcare and education, where space can play a pivotal role. So let's see tonight or today, this morning, depending where you are, what our experts think about this. And to help answer these crucial questions, we have a fantastic speakers with us, and let me introduce them. So first of all, Jeff, welcome Jeff. Jeff Matthews is a specialist leader at Deloitte Consulting LLP with more than 15 years of private and public sector experience focused on finance, enterprise architecture, transformation, technology commercialization, and market strategy. Currently, he is leader in Deloitte's government and public sector space industry practice, where he provides subject matter expertise on commercial space, technology trends, industry strategies, and launch systems economics. So thank you, Jeff, from LA. Rainer Horn is managing partner at Space Tech Partners, and he is a seasoned management consultant, policy advisor, entrepreneur, and investor with distinct experience in space, geospatial, automotive, mobility, and public sector. He is an advisor to European high-tech programs and innovation centers, and has a wide expertise and network in high-tech industries and institutions in Europe and Asia Pacific. He is a member of Europe's Galileo Program Advisory Board, the French Aerospace Academy, and the steering committee of Multi-GNSS Asia. He is also one of our distinguished members of EBAN Space Executive Committee, and Rainer is a regular speaker at investment, technology, and institutional conferences. So thanks, Rainer, to be with us. And last but not least, we have the pleasure to have Alexandre Mensik, who is a skillful entrepreneur and a senior executive with over 25 years global experience in representing and managing the interests of aerospace and other organizations. He co-founded startups, he is an investor and serves as mentor and board member in various companies. He is a former executive director and board member of a Fortune 200 company, and he represented clients involved in regulated industries, and he also served in the European Commission. Alexandre has a background in spacecraft techniques and technologies from CNES, also in space resources. He is a lawyer, graduated from Louvain in Belgium, and he has a master's degree in air and space law from McGill University in Canada. So as you see, we have really the chance to have great speakers tonight. If you have questions, please type your questions into the chat box, and we will try to respond as much as we can to your questions. And also, please turn off your microphone and camera if you are not a speaker. So let's kick in after my introduction. Let's kick in the discussion, and I will start with Jeff actually. And Jeff, if you look back at early 2020, do you think that things have changed with the COVID-19 crisis for the space sector and space technology? So if you look back at early 2020 and now where we are, what has changed actually?
So absolutely, there's been a massive change from what we were seeing back in, say, January or February of this year. And to step it back just a little bit from a context perspective, we do a benchmark every year for the Global Aerospace and Defense Industry Outlook. It's published. If you Google Deloitte Global Aerospace and Defense Outlook, you can get the report for free. In case you've got any more questions. But really, we saw a strong year in 2018. And in 2019, we saw a bit of a minor decline, primarily due to the sluggishness in commercial aircraft production. But we saw some very encouraging factors around defense, the space segment in general, and sort of the potential for M&A. So going into 2020 in a pre-COVID environment, we sort of expected 4 pillars to sort of play out over the next 12, maybe 18 months. We saw several things from robust military expenditures. We saw that a growth in global defense spending and the subsequent demand for military equipment, including spacecraft launch services and satellites, is likely to create increased opportunities for defense contractors and their supply chains. We saw strong aircraft demand. The long-term demand for commercial aircraft was continuing to remain robust, with nearly 40,000 to be produced over the next 2 decades, and with a large back order, I think, between the 2 major primes at about 14,000 aircraft. And we also saw long-term drivers looking around M&A. While we predicted that there was going to be less of the mega deals coming out, both in the traditional aerospace and defense and space industry, we did expect consolidation to continue. And then we saw that the last of the 4 pillars, space, driving towards modernization. So the space sector was poised to experience steady investments in new and increasing technologies and services, with funding primarily coming from governments and venture capital. So that was the outlook that we sort of went into 2020 with, very sort of optimistic after a slower 2019, but really looking towards the horizon at a couple things. This sort of outlook was buoyed by what looked as though it would be a stronger return in the aerospace and defense market writ large, combined with some firsts this year in the space industry, including 2 firsts that may happen anywhere between an hour from now and the end of the week, which would be one of the new launch entrants to launch their first horizontal rocket, and then obviously the commercial crew flight that's going to take place on Wednesday out of Florida here in the United States. So looking at 2020, we were very optimistic about what we're seeing. And now we flash forward about 90 days ahead. We're 9 sort of weeks or so into the COVID environment, and we're seeing a very different reality, I would say. Global air travel has ground to a halt. Venture funding, at least in the United States, is getting very more specific about where it's investing, what its returns look like, and small businesses are definitely struggling. So I think you're starting to see some of the fragility in the space industry here, at least in the United States, sort of play out. We've seen some notable exits from launch providers through, in-space habitation providers, and I expect more of that to continue. I don't know what the current fact is these days, but if you look at it, there's usually anywhere from between about 60 to 70 launch companies trying to produce somewhere between 100 and 120 new launch vehicles, including incumbents. And that just kind of robust view of the market in a let's all sort of follow the leader is going to have to shake out in a post-COVID environment. And I think we're already starting to see that. I will say I do remain optimistic that there are definitely opportunities for expansion, for upsides to investors, and just growth in the industry. A couple things that were really positive here in the United States is the role that the U.S. Department of Defense is taking, where they are really acting as a demand driver and a market signaling organization by trying to put more money in through rapid acquisitions and same-day funding through their AFWorks venture programs, all the way through the Space Enterprise Consortium that could be as high as $12 billion over the next couple of years for direct industry investments in non-traditional and prototype capabilities. So there's some really good stuff on the horizon. I think what we really need to see come out of this is a better sort of alignment of the demand and the supply segments, and a robust signaling from the demand side to help sort of drive success in the post-COVID environment. I do think from an industrial-based perspective, at least in the States and in other countries, space can be quite resilient. And I know that there are a lot of states through nations that are looking at the future of their post-economic recovery being very centered around the aerospace and defense industry, and especially the growth potential in the space segment specifically. So again, cautiously optimistic, but a wild change from where we were 3 months ago.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff, for this. Rainer, you travel worldwide. You are based in Europe. What do you think about this fragility that Jeff mentioned about US? What about Europe or maybe other parts of the world? And also, I think it would be interesting if you give also your view about entrepreneurs, because you are meeting a lot of entrepreneurs as an investor, but also with space tech partners. For example, you are co-organizing the Copernicus Accelerator. So what do you think? Are we really in this fragility that Jeff mentioned? What do you think?
I think we have to somehow, good afternoon or good evening to everybody first and foremost. Thanks for the opportunity. I think we have to clearly differentiate between the different elements that we're talking about and what Jeff has been alluding to, aviation, defense, and space. Interestingly enough, obviously, there are big corporations around the world who do all three, but space is only a small fraction of it. Aviation, we don't have to talk much about. It will take years until it recovers, and it will have real huge repercussions. And we'll probably have repercussions also for especially those groups who have to consolidate, who will not sell as many airplanes, but even some of them like Airbus, who had already announced, I just looked it up, on the 19th of February, just when the crisis was not yet in Europe, Airbus Defence and Space announced 2,300 people to be laid off, probably mainly in defense, but it would also have affected space. And if you look at some of the other primes, they equally have a defense, an aviation, and a space business, and they will also be somewhat affected. And I think that's also an impact that it will have for the entrepreneurs at a later stage. Taking a bit more of a European perspective, I'd say, first and foremost, Europe is somewhat lucky when it comes to space only. The ESA budgets have just been secured for the next 2-3 years at a record budget, which also affects a lot of SME and entrepreneurs. The EU budgets, they will certainly be revamped, but probably not curbed any further than what is currently foreseen for the next 7 years in its planning process right now. We also see that space and defense and European resilience and European autonomy will be higher on the agenda. A new DG in Brussels has been founded called Defense and Space. Synergy is being sought, maybe a bit to a smaller extent with smaller budgets than originally foreseen, but still I think it's a positive vector. The big space integrators, they will be busy with their aviation crisis activities in the group. They typically have to lay off people across the things and so forth, and are probably a bit hampered and will not be as dynamic going forward, creating an opportunity for entrepreneurs, startups, SME. Public sector demand, I would say, on average, is probably going up in Europe in this regard. New programs are being started also by the European Union on space traffic management, on GovSatcom, and so forth. So public sector is probably buying still as much as they were before. Whether they're fast enough in it is a different story. Also, I believe there is a growth in technology and science will be a solution for earthly problems of some sort. Now, real negative things for Europeans who are experts are record holders in exports when it comes to space and rocket launches and so forth. Exports are probably going down, and you can travel less, you can less sell even your small CubeSat test kits for universities that some European companies do very successfully. And it will be much more tough to get public grants because more and more people will source that cheap equity or that cheap amount of money. So that's all from the business perspective I'd like to say. Now, startups also have a different market to serve. They have the investor market, which will be their lifeline. Startups will go through a similar problem like other startups, that investors are currently nervous. Investors are possibly first looking at what they have in the portfolio, they're weeding out, they're trying to increase reach, they're trying to ask them to save money where possible, probably give up on some of them. They might not tell them yet, but they might be giving up on some of their investments and rather focus on where they see the real opportunities. They will probably rather invest in a competitor of what they already have when this competitor is in trouble, to consolidate, help to have consolidation, than to go into something totally different. But many of these things apply across industry for all type of startups. Space is maybe a bit special in one or two ways. In one way, space startups tend to have more a perspective on the public sector and public sector grants, which are a bit more patient and which are also giving a lifeline. On the other hand, they're very difficult to explain to generic investors. So generic investors who haven't really touched the subject yet are probably very hesitant at this moment to touch something that is a bit out of whack for them or sounds a bit crazy and so forth. Those closer to an earthly business, offering a software as a service solution on Earth, which they more likely understand, the generic tech investors, are probably faring better than somebody who wants to build a shuttle to go to moon or to mine on other planets or other on asteroids, etc., etc. So I guess those are really the main points. And you also need to see that the investors themselves typically invest when they have proceeds from somewhere else, when they have made an exit, or when a fund has successfully closed. I think as the perspective of exits is not happening at the moment, very few funds will close. Very little of that amount by their investors is being freed up. So new funds are probably not immediately coming into being. We still have to remind ourselves, though, that venture funds in the last 2-3 years, we had record number of funds created in Europe and also in Germany and in France. These guys have firepower that eventually has to be displayed and deployed. So one could well assume that startups have to face lower valuations. That means they have to give up more shares than they anticipated for 1 million euro of investment or so. But that's again a characteristic which is probably across industry. So let me pause here at this moment. Maybe just give a short comment on our business. We are, as a service provider and consultancy advisory firm, we've been faring very well. We've actually had the opportunity to hire extra staff in this period because we had extra work, some of it COVID related, to help our institutional clients with project management activities. We also had a few inquiries from startup companies asking for market development help, asking for outreach help, because they realize that they're locked down and they cannot at this moment travel around and network at conferences.
Okay, thank you, Rainer. Very interesting. So let's now see about the public sector, and we have a specialist with us, Alexandre. So we know that the space sector depends heavily of public funding. I think it's about 25%, let's say, globally. And this probably gives some resilience to the space sector. It was, let's say, mentioned by Rainer and Jeff. How is the public sector reacting to the COVID-19? Is it an inhibitor, enabler, accelerator? Can you give us some concrete, let's say, examples of what's happening on the public side? Alexander.
Thanks, Fabrice. Thanks. Good morning, good evening. So first of all, I agree with what has been said by my distinguished colleagues. I think with this consensus in the panel about that's difficult to find good news resulting from the COVID crisis, but maybe some resilience. On the public side, what should I mention is a lot of. My first observation is that states having decided to shut down the planet bear the responsibility for all the consequences. Having said that, I feel personally they are reacting quite quickly and strongly. On the EU side, you have seen probably a lot of reactions ongoing. It's worthwhile mentioning that all the state aid rules have been relaxed, so countries can take measures to support their own industry. We have, the Commission has made follow, they will not take actions against excessive deficits, which means that, yes, thanks, Candace. Yes, so the excessive deficit procedures will not apply, and so states are free to support their industry. You have seen the central banks, on both sides of the Atlantic, the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve, acting very quickly. I feel it's really amazing to see how things are developing. As you may know, before 2008, central banks were essentially managing something like 5% of the GDP, the worldwide GDP. Now, before the crisis, they are already managing something around 40% of the GDP, and I would not be surprised that in 1 or 2 years from now, central banks will be managing more than 50% of the GDP. I think that's a fundamental change to the way society is structured. So central banks taking actions. In the EU, a lot of discussions about the recovery plan. Who knows how much money will be available? Initially, it was €1 trillion euro announced. More likely that it would be around 500 billion euro available. What I would like to mention there is that the recovery plan is not yet clear whether they will support the space sector. It's ongoing discussions, and they may be focusing more on those who have suffered more and perceive that the space sector don't need to be to benefit from the recovery plan. Having said that, they of course have announced, as you may have seen, that all the money for the recovery plan will be channeled via the EU programs. And I think that's important, because if we're going through the EU programs, then the programs rule apply, and there will be priorities. And in my view, I see three priorities, at least from a European perspective. One is the Green Deal. Clearly, everything which is environmentally friendly may get some money, Digitalization, which was already a hot topic before the crisis, but I think the crisis has made it even more important to focus on digitalization, included, and then resilience. And resilience, it's as I think it was mentioned by Rainer, initially was focusing on health and what can we do to support creating new vaccines and so on. Now gradually they're starting to look as to whether or not other industrial sectors are resilient. And I think that's maybe a slight good news for the space sector, because I think the space sector, in terms of the capability for the importance of the space sector for the EU economy is still clear. So I see this as a slightly good news out of an important crisis. Then just to highlight to support what Jeff mentioned, which is important, that the military sector has expressed the need to support the space sector. We have not seen that too much in Europe right now. It may happen unofficially, but officially, I've seen very little, commitment from the military or sector to support the space sector. But it may happen unofficially. So that's about it.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Alexandre. Maybe, yeah, we can let's say jump to Jeff, and that maybe he can explain this collision of commercial space and national security space in US, and what that means not only for the US but maybe globally. Alexandre already explained that maybe in Europe is less present, but maybe Jeff, you have some perspective outside the US, what's happening in that respect.
Sure. So it's real interesting to see, this sort of controlled collision, and I mean collision in a good way, right? About where commercial space applications, operations, capabilities are starting to align with sort of the needs and the outlooks of the national security community. We're seeing this in quite a few areas, and one of the key terms that's sort of thrown around about this is resilience. And traditionally, I think resilience has really been about maintaining space superiority, assured access to space, and the ability to sort of operate unfettered in pursuit of the national security mission in a sort of a resilient manner. But we've seen in the last couple months that I think it's also starting to apply much more to the industry itself. Couple larger overarching pieces of sort of findings have come out. There was a massive study that was done in the United States by the RAND Corporation under their Project Air Force supporting the US Space Force that talked about just the resilience of the industrial base in supporting national security launch perspective. So, currently you have two main providers in the United States that provide heavy launch, and their argument was, given the new product iteration cycles, sort of the go-to-market or market entry of some of the next generation of launch vehicles, especially in the heavy launch perspective, and the sort of just long lead development times that come with an inherent risk of delays, of the idea of trying to ensure that there was more resiliency in the industrial base writ large. So I think you're going to see some really interesting sort of moves by the defense and security community to really sort of bolster that. In the States, if you are a startup right now, there's a great amount, there's a very good amount of opportunities that you can focus on about trying to overlap your product service capability with the national security sort of apparatus and industry needs. A couple of them are just simplified acquisition rules in the wake of a post-COVID environment. The United States government has upped the limit to about $750,000 for sole source simplified acquisitions. They've done more, fast acquisitions from a prototype perspective, and they're willing to put more skin in the game, which I think is great. The other interesting thing that we're seeing this play out from a sort of international perspective is also as the US is moving to use commercial space, or at least investigate commercial space capabilities, we're definitely seeing some momentum by the other sort of allied nations, especially around the Five Eyes intelligence community, in a sort of a bit of a follow the leader perspective. But we're hearing from some of the foreign ministries of defense or defense departments that they're very interested in what sort of the next generation of space superiority, space launch, space capabilities, and even just commercial space applications like commercial space-based internet can really do for the defense and intelligence community. So I think it was Alexandra who said, we're not seeing a lot of overt open actions from some of the other, like the EU MODs or some of the other sort of defense and intelligence agencies. But I think that, behind the scenes, we're starting to see a lot of movement. At least we're seeing a lot of that conversation sort of play out here in the States. And then the other thing I would say is that, as we look towards some of these grand ambitions, and I'll say whether that is, the return to the moon, whether that is the stand-up of the United States Space Force, whether that is, I believe the UK Ministry of Defense just stood up or is in the process of standing up their version of Space Command as well. The era of doing this all alone, by only on the government dime, where the government is the owner, the operator, the prime user, the prime funder, I think is quickly coming to an end. And I think that really will help the industry over the next decade, because that is a different source of demand capital that is a little less sort of volatile, in the way that public markets generally would be. So I'm optimistic, and I like that we're starting to see more of this controlled collision, because I think it only becomes beneficial when you can create sort of the symphonic enterprise around space.
Okay, thank you. Rainer, where do you see the potential opportunities? Alexandre mentioned the Green Deal, the digitalization, the resilience. Jeff talked about the opportunities for entrepreneurs in the defense side in the US. We also hear a lot about education. I think ESA launched some call about, some innovative ideas using space for education. Where do you see today potential opportunities, and are they changed because of the COVID? I think you are on mute. Sorry.
Yes, hello. So clearly in Europe, we don't have the same public sector muscle as the US has, and not the same federated muscle. Having said that, Europe is able to shape and do things on a national level. We've just seen a French consortium standing up an IoT constellation, a spin-off from CNES. There are big forces from Europe trying to rescue OneWeb and so forth in that. So Europe can act, but it definitely doesn't have the federal consolidated budgets available like the US has. And from the outside, it always looks like more federated than it is. Behind the scenes, the US is fighting as much about geo return as the ESA member states and the companies behind. So, but coming more for the real opportunities at this moment, clearly resilience and helping the public sector to build capabilities that allow Europe to have their own infrastructure, information sources, being it for space traffic management, space dangers of some kind, but also federated capabilities in the area of satellite communications are being worked on as we speak, and further differentiating and honing the network of people working on the Copernicus and the Galileo program. So those will continue to provide opportunities. However, the budgets will not skyrocket through that, but there's more and more opportunities for new innovative players to come in. Europe has, on the public sector side, clearly seen that innovation is vital and is relevant from startups and SME to help solve some problems and to help shaping services alongside. And that is definitely an area where more and more things are happening. Also, companies that are providing cross-functional capabilities, bringing AI capabilities or robotics, merging them with GNSS capabilities, thinking a bit left and right from space only. I think those have good opportunities and might find their customers more readily here. Given the fact that we in Europe have a strong export-oriented industry, I believe a good starting point also for entrepreneurs is to systematically dock with some of them that can be multipliers in helping them bring their IoT solutions or their geointelligence solutions to the world, not expecting that you can do it all by yourself.
Okay, so there are quite opportunities. That's always nice to hear, of course. I would like to start to answer some questions from the audience, and we have a question for Alexandre from Fadi Nafa. Do you think, Alexandre, that the current rules and regulations are up to speed to open up the market for players other than governments?
Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I think it's okay, but there is room for improvements. I see areas of improvements in the EU. For instance, I think we could learn from the US. The US have streamlined the licensing process for space operations. They have reduced the fee considerably. I think down from 50 to less than 2K. That's something which could happen in Europe, or should happen maybe in Europe as well. So there is some lobbying to be made there. I still feel the public procurement rules and the standards are a bit of a legacy of the past and should be adapted to NewSpace. So I think there are a few things there. For instance, we need anchor customer agreements. We need a framework to be able, as in the US, to liaise, to have public-private partnerships, which create win-win solutions. That's not really up to speed right now. And also in terms of, a question mark, but with all my respect for them, should for instance, the European Space Agency monopoly on the design standards for missions? You may have seen that some space agencies are in favor of relaxing design standards and allowing the private sector to have a larger role to play in the design of a space mission. So, in a nutshell, it could be worse, but I think there are room for improvements and still a lot of work to do.
Okay. We have a question for Jeff. So you mentioned that there are dozens of launcher companies. So do you think that the current crisis is an opportunity for investors to see somehow what are the good investments or the bad ones? So a sort of reality check.
Oh, absolutely. I think, and I've argued this for a long time, that there's a glut of too many launchers in a follow the leader scenario where, people are gravitating towards small launch. So, small vertical rockets with low cost, potentially high cadence launch frequencies, which I wholeheartedly do believe that the industry needs, but we don't need like 20 different variants of them. There's still other gaps in the launch services market, especially in the medium, sort of launch market. And so I'm hopeful that you'll see some of these play out. I also do wonder, though, if this will also drive some, consolidation in the launch services market as well. There are some companies out there that I think have some great manufacturing technologies, which, whether or not their specific launch vehicle will actually fill a need in the market, I think that their specific, technology and their technology roadmaps would be a huge value add when combined with other launchers or other capabilities. So I do believe that we're going to see this down to the consolidation, and I think it will give a good reality check. I think you'll see maybe, a handful of the small launchers play out. I think the medium launch market is still a bit up for grabs. So we haven't seen a lot fly in the medium sort of range in a long time. And then I think the heavy launch services market is really going to be determined, over the next couple of years, not in the immediate sort of, post-COVID recovery environment.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I think since we are talking about investments, I think, Candice, you wanted to say just a few words about how Seraphim is investing today, because I think it's an interesting insight that you can.
Yeah. So thank you. So so I am speaking with my hat as chair of the Seraphim Corporate Advisory Board, but I have to say I'm very, very happy to, have helped get EBAN Space together and have this wonderful webinar series with NewSpace Capital. So what we have done at Seraphim is that our 13 portfolio companies are actually all doing well at the moment. And we had kept a lot of dry powder. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. And so what we have decided to do in this COVID time is that whereas we had thought we would not be making any more investments, we've decided actually to, add to maybe about 9 more investments so that we would have 22 investments because the valuations are low. We can get some pretty good deals. And, and there are some very exciting companies out there. So, from our perspective, we are seeing that the companies we invested in are all being used. There may be 1 or 2 we may lose, but most of them are all being used. There's a great necessity for connectivity, for observation, for all of this. And that since they are doing well, that we will now, liberate the money, not all, but, some of it that we've been holding back to make new investments because we think that it's a great time to invest now.
Great. Thanks, Candice, for this input. Very, very helpful to understand what investors are looking for. In the same, let's say, spirit, Chiara is asking, and maybe Rainer, you can answer to this question. In your opinion, do you think that investments in Europe will be more upstream or downstream oriented? And would you invest in a private military startup?
Okay, now for the first one, upstream or downstream, I think we're talking different orders of magnitude. So maybe the number of investments are certainly much higher in downstream and will continue to be higher in downstream. Maybe the absolute amounts there will be more money going eventually in upstream. I would concur what was said earlier. There will be not a consolidation, but a shakeout when it comes to small launchers, and possibly a mix of consolidation and shakeout when it comes to some SATCOM constellations, because there's quite a few being planned, and ultimately it's about spectrum and efficiency of execution there. We have to see. Now, answering the question on private military startup, a lot depends on where is your company from. Do you have a home market? Are you serving some home military potentially? I don't think there's that much opportunity if you are just somebody who wants to serve everybody. Yeah, you will automatically restrict the world market to a number of players that you can serve, even if you're based in Switzerland or if you were to be based in a more neutral country. So I think it depends on the application. For me personally, as an angel investor, the amounts you can invest probably don't get you very far towards a military program, but definitely always interested to look at opportunities and helping to see where we can take them.
Okay. Thanks, Rainer. Maybe because there is a question, I think, which is a bit also related to, I would say, your sphere of expertise. There are different, let's say, European answers to the COVID-19. And do you think they will look more at developing internal capabilities with national space agencies or more international cooperation? So what do you think?
I don't know what it's exactly referring to, what Adriana is asking. If they're looking at the so-called tracking applications and mitigation applications to help the COVID crisis using space opportunities, I guess there are some efforts clearly on a European base. We are involved in at least one of them called Galileo Green Lane, helping trucks to freely float across borders and building transparencies for that. On the national level, the so-called contact apps and so forth, they're predominantly using eventually Bluetooth connectivity of some sort. Yes, there are some that use central and some that use decentral approaches. But interestingly enough, that's not because of political interest. It's largely because of Apple and Google not making a central solution possible if you dig into it. A lot
Yes.
of political interpretation is being made, but ultimately we are listening to what GAFA is doing, which is a frightening thing. For those of you who are more interested in the international comparison, SpaceTech has done, together with our Asian partners, a comprehensive analysis of these solutions in Asia. That's available on gnss.asia and very soon also on our website, spacetech.partners.
Okay, thank you, Rainer. We have a question for Alexandre, but I think Jeff maybe can also give the US perspective. So maybe you can answer quickly, both of you. In which specific space area do you think that new approaches such as public-private partnerships, or PPP, and anchor customer would be more efficient and advisable? Alexandre, maybe you can start.
Yes, thanks. So thanks for the question. Well, I see many possible areas. I think in the launch, for launching programs, that could be helpful. Personally, to echo Renier, I think space situational awareness and the question of tracking and monitoring space debris, there I think it could be an area where for public-private partnership, I think this area has a lot of opportunities. It could become part of the EU programs. It's of course related to green technology because it's ensuring a space ecosystem, and then it's also of dual use because clearly the need to track and monitor space debris is relevant for both civilian and military use. So that is an area where I think partnerships will welcome. And then maybe we should think broader, and honestly I don't have an answer, but see if we can build some European interest around space. And you know that, for instance, there is hydrogen has been seen as of European interest. So maybe the space sector could be seen as of European interest. But I feel strongly that it could help addressing all 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. So maybe it's time to think very broad, but good question, Dan.
Okay. Jeff, the US perspective on this, on the PPP question?
Yeah, so I agree with all the previous comments too. I think they're spot on. In the US, we're actually seeing a very strong sort of P3 perspective around launch ranges and the supporting infrastructure. Specifically, you've seen some of this play out with the Space Florida sort of organization and their redevelopment of the sort of land and capabilities around the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral. We're working, me specifically, on some stuff around Vandenberg here on the West Coast as well. And I think you really see an opportunity to bring in not just like the sort of the private space companies, but also like the surrounding communities, the infrastructure companies, and that can lead to development of roads and fiber optic broadband infrastructure, housing, et cetera. So I think there's really an opportunity for a large amount of P3 sort of, interest around both the sort of the space, I'll say centers of excellence, whether they're centered around launch ranges or capabilities or manufacturing hubs, et cetera. And I think you're going to continue to see that over the next little while, especially as you see that collision of commercial space and government space. And then the area globally that I'm just really personally interested in is the ability around sort of P3 for human space flight. NASA has stated that eventually they want to be either an anchor tenant or one of many customers for the human space flight mission. And even this week, as you see the first commercial astronauts go from US soil, I think that really starts to open the aperture, not just for NASA, but also for some of the European countries and also just, the international community to get more involved in the human space flight sort of, mission and function and bring more capital into that. There's a lot of structural barriers still, the cost barrier is still very high. The cadence just isn't there yet, but I think we're trending in the right direction. And I think that's an area where you could see some really good global P3 sort of communities and organizations come out around the human spaceflight mission.
What about space tourism, will it be also a PPP enabler for space tourism?
I think it could be. So I was fortunate enough to be one of the groups that looked at NASA's commercialization of low Earth orbit study a couple of years ago. And so that's why I still argue that there's some structural barriers that need to be overcome. In some cases, I think a P3 organization could really move the needle on that. And in some cases, I think they're going to be dependent upon the supply side to really get through some of the cost and cadence challenges that are out there. I would love to see, a demand side led effort around P3, especially as people are championing, microgravity, sort of value added, experimentation around advanced materials, life sciences, biotech, etc. I don't think we see enough of the demand side coming to the table, and a lot of the conversation is very supply side focused. So if we could figure out how to bridge more of that with a P3 sort of organization or construct, I think that could be very impactful.
Okay. We have another question from Santil Kumar about India. And the question is basically if European companies would collaborate with India companies. Personally, I don't see why not, but just a very quick answer, because I would like to leave the last 5 minutes for the last words. Who wants to answer to this? Rainer?
Yeah, well, we're working a lot with Asia, and in particular also with India. Foreign direct investment has so far been mostly a country-by-country approach.
Okay.
Clearly, I think we'll see some more things happening there, but we first have to have the crisis behind us, and I think properly behind us. I think for both countries, you cannot do much international travel and business without meeting the people. If there's a precedent, you can do a lot of things and you can build a lot of activities if you know people in person. But starting complex projects like that from the start, I'm afraid that we'll have to wait for the situation to clear up again.
Okay, so we have a couple of few minutes, so maybe Rainer, because you were talking, maybe in 1-2 minutes, what is your message for the audience? I think we have here some investors, we have entrepreneurs, we have maybe some people from public government. What is your message that you want to deliver?
Well, I guess there's certainly now a sense of realism that will prevail now. We will see, as I indicated, some shakeout amongst mini launchers, some recalibration of outer space and outer space ambitions. But with the exception of military and American-driven military or dual-use ambitions. Let's face it, whatever telescope is being developed, whatever robotic activity on the moon is being used, it also has a secondary use. Let's be open about that. Security in space, non-dependence, resilience will continue to be key growth areas. And I would say for the space opportunity to really be harvested, the need of space specialized angels like we are, or space specialized investors is needed more than ever before to help the non-space VCs who have less patience and less stamina to help them through the jungle and see really which one has an opportunity, which one is not an opportunity. And obviously it's going to be an acceleration when it comes to new space versus traditional space. I think some agile players, also privately owned groups, will possibly help some startups that don't make it by themselves, integrate them, acquire some businesses, and grow intelligently through that.
Okay, thank you, Rainer. So patience and realism. Alexandre, you want to say 1 minute?
Yeah, I mean, I have frankly one key message is or recommendation, if I may, it's to focus on sustainable development. I mean, this will increase your chance to get funding, whether it's public and or private support. And there's so much to be done. If you are interested about the space sector, you can very clearly support any of the or all of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think you are in good shape. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. Yes, I think it's good for the planet, indeed. And Jeff, 1 minute to, as a conclusion or your message you want to deliver to the audience.
Sure. I mean, I would say at the end of the day, I remain, cautiously optimistic about what the future holds. I think we are definitely going to see some challenges and some things shake out, some of which I think has been needed for a little while. But I do believe that there's some good upside there. There are companies in different parts of the area across the entire space value chain that are really providing differentiated services, capabilities, platforms, and products that have a demand segment that's diverse enough to sort of weather this storm. I am really interested in the role here in the US that the US Department of Defense can play in terms of advancing some of that. I'm really optimistic about areas where you're starting to see more demand players come into the market. And then I'm still, sort of cautious on, do we really need, 40 to 80,000 satellites, sort of up there providing internet from space. But I do believe, if we come into this from a very sort of, cautious and diligent approach, there is potential upside. And I think the next decade, we're going to see some very good growth in the key segments that really have, valid demand segments. So again, cautiously optimistic, but it's definitely going to be a challenging storm to weather in the short term.
Okay, so let me thank you all the speakers. I think you did a great job, and I think it was a very interesting discussion, in my opinion. I would say that if I summarize, yes, we need to be realistic. We need to be patient because maybe the crisis will not finish very soon. There are opportunities like sustainability, and maybe the crisis will be somehow a kind of filter to let's say keep the cream above the coffee, if I would say like this, where maybe we will, the best maybe companies will probably survive. And maybe the ones with the weak business models or the weak, let's say, execution team, maybe unfortunately they will fail. So thank you a lot. I encourage all the audience to attend the other webinars. There will be 5 more webinars this week. So please, register if not. And on this, I wish all of you a very good day or evening, and see you next webinars. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.